Chapter 9, Section 2, African Americans in World War II. Building background. Imagine going to bed one night and waking up the next day to find out that your country is at war. That situation happened on December 7, 1941. Japanese fighter planes had dropped their deadly payloads on the U.S. fleet anchored in Hawaii's Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. War in Europe and the Pacific. At first, many Americans opposed entering World War II. 2 years after the war had begun in Europe, however, events in the Pacific sparked American involvement. War begins in Europe. Even before the war began, Hitler infuriated people worldwide with his expressions of racism. He believed that Germans belonged to a master race and promoted a belief in the racial superiority of the German people. Hitler blamed Jews for the world's problems and claimed that other groups were subhuman. Poles, Slavs, the Romani, people of color, homosexuals, and people with disabilities were also targets for Nazi prejudice. In an effort to realize his dream of uniting all ethnic Germans, Hitler tried to force the Austrian government to agree to union with Germany in 1938. When Austria refused, Hitler sent troops into the country. Later that year, he seized land from neighboring Czechoslovakia. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, World War II began. Finally, Great Britain and France had enough of his actions, and both countries declared war on Germany and Italy, its ally. At first, the United States stayed out of the conflict. After victory in World War I, many Americans thought that the United States should remain uninvolved in this new war. They favored a policy of isolationism, or non-involvement in world affairs. Isolationists thought that World War II was a European problem that need not concern the United States. President Franklin Roosevelt disagreed. However, public attitudes against the war prevented him from getting the country involved. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Those attitudes changed when Germany's other ally, Japan, attacked the Pearl Harbor naval base in the Hawaiian Islands, a U.S. territory, in 1941. Early on the morning of December 7th of that year, Japanese fighter planes appeared in the sky above Pearl Harbor. The planes rained down bombs on the unprepared American fleet. American troops valiantly tried to repel the attack, but they had been so surprised by the arrival of the Japanese that they were not even able to launch planes into the air before they were destroyed. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese hit 8 battleships, sinking 4, and destroying nearly 200 aircraft. Even worse, more than 2,000 American soldiers died in the attack. Within a day of the attack, Roosevelt asked Congress for and received a declaration of war against Japan. In response, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. As a result, the United States sent troops to Europe as well. The nation had entered World War II. The course of the war. With heavy fighting taking place in both Europe and the Pacific, World War II was truly a global conflict. It was the largest and bloodiest war in all of world history, taking the lives of more than 40 million people and causing billions of dollars worth of damages. That World War II changed the world forever is no exaggeration. In Europe, the war had been going badly for the Allied powers before 1941. The arrival of American forces, however, helped turn the tide. Still, fierce fighting continued in Western, Eastern, and Southern Europe. The major turning point in the war in Europe came in June 1944 with the D-Day invasion. On June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, where a German army was camped. By July, nearly 1 million soldiers had come ashore. Though costly, the D-Day invasion was successful. From Normandy, the Allies marched steadily east, coming closer and closer to Germany. Despite a heavy German counterattack known as the Battle of the Bulge, which slowed the Allied advance for several months, the Germans could not stop them. Finally, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Fighting in the Pacific was just as deadly. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese won a string of victories in the Pacific, invading and claiming numerous islands. In late 1941, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, an American-controlled territory which Japan conquered after a few months of fighting. The war looked bleak for the Allies. Shortly after the loss of the Philippines, however, the Allies' fortunes changed. Led by the Americans, the Allies won significant victories in the battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Following these victories, the Allies began a strategy called island hopping. They used air, sea, and ground forces to capture key islands, from which they launched offensives against other strategic points. Through this strategy, Allied forces slowly advanced on Japan. Despite many losses, Japan refused to surrender. Finally, U.S. President Harry S. Truman decided to take drastic measures. He ordered the Army to use America's newest weapon, the atomic bomb, to bring the Japanese to surrender. After two incredibly deadly bombs destroyed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed more than 100,000, Japan finally surrendered on August 14, 1945. African Americans do their part. At home and on the war front, African Americans contributed to the eventual victory over Germany and Japan. About 1 million black men and women served in the armed forces. The military remained segregated until 1948, however, and most blacks were assigned to service and support positions. One black recruit complained, "We can take no pride in our armed forces. We can become no more than flunkies in the Army and kitchen boys in the Navy." African American soldiers. As the war went on, African Americans made slow gains. In all, 22 black combat units fought in Europe. Among them, the 969th Field Artillery won a Distinguished Unit Citation for outstanding courage. Near the end of the war in Europe, during the decisive Battle of the Bulge, black and white soldiers fought side by side to drive back a fierce German attack. General George S. Patton told his troops, "I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill Germans." But segregation returned to all units after the German surrender in 1945. Despite the racism that existed in the armed forces, some black soldiers managed to rise through the ranks. For example, in 1940, Benjamin O. Davis became the first African American general in the Army. Subsequent tours of duty took Davis to the Philippines, Africa, Europe, and various places within the United States. Davis also taught at Tuskegee Institute and Wilberforce University. In 1942, he became advisor on Negro problems in Europe, and in 1944 was named special assistant to the commanding general in France. During his years in the military, General Davis rendered invaluable service, earning the Distinguished Service Medal and the Bronze Star. He also won several foreign awards and honors, including the Croix de Guerre with Palm from France. After 50 years of service, he retired in 1948. Among Tuskegee Airmen. Among the African American groups who fought valiantly in World War II were the Tuskegee Airmen, a division of the Army Air Corps. The division was formed in 1941 after black soldiers protested that they were not being allowed to take an active role in the war. With support from the NAACP and black newspapers, the soldiers finally convinced the Army to allow them to fight in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen got their name from Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where they trained. They were fighter pilots, about 1,000 of them in total. Their first commander was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the famous general. Davis later became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. The group escorted bombing missions and attacked enemy airfields, supply centers, and communication lines. During the war, the Tuskegee Airmen won great acclaim for their bravery and their successful record. They flew nearly 16,000 missions and destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft. For their efforts, members of the group won more than 900 medals and honors, and in 2006, more than 60 years after the end of World War II, Congress voted to award them the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor that Congress can give. African American women in the war. African American women also made great contributions to the war effort. In July 1943, the U.S. Congress created the Women's Army Corps. At first, the African American women who joined were only allowed such duties as hospital service for black soldiers. As the war continued, however, their tasks were expanded to such positions as lab technicians and librarians. In 1944, the Army opened its hospital doors to black nurses. By the end of the year, African American nurses were treating white soldiers. On March 8, 1945, Phyllis May Daly became the first black woman in the Navy Nurse Corps. In later wars, black women served successfully in the Nurse Corps as well. In 1945, some 800 black women formed the 688th Central Postal Battalion in Europe. This battalion was given the important mission of establishing a central postal directory in Europe. The unit received praise for its performance, which included arranging for the delivery of 3 million pieces of backlogged mail. African Americans on the home front. Not all of the contributions that African Americans made to winning World War II happened in Europe and the Pacific. Thousands of blacks in the United States worked to ensure victory by fighting the war on the home front. Working on the home front. With so many young men away at war, factories were faced with a labor shortage. African Americans were now welcomed into the workforce along with other people of color. Thousands of black men found factory jobs, such as airplane builders, ship builders, welders, auto mechanics, and radio operators. Many black women also found themselves part of the workforce for the first time. As African Americans entered the workforce, they joined labor unions, to which no black members had previously belonged. African American union members took on prominent roles in unions, such as the United Auto Workers and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Contributing to the war effort. Black Americans also worked alongside their white neighbors to raise financial and moral support for the war effort. They bought war bonds, a type of savings bond that raised money to support the armed forces. They also held rallies in schools and churches to encourage others to support the war and to buy bonds. In 1941, the government created the Office of Civilian Defense, OCD, whose goal was to maintain American morale and ensure that civilians remained safe in case of an attack against the United States. African Americans occupied many prominent positions within this organization. One of its high-level officers was Crystal Bird Fawcett of Philadelphia, who served as the Race Relations Officer to the OCD. Previously, Fawcett served as a state legislator, the first African American woman ever to hold that post. African Americans also joined in efforts to conserve food and other goods during the war. Some planted victory gardens to help overcome food shortages and preserve valuable resources for the military. Others worked on ration boards that regulated the distribution of food products with limited availability, such as butter, coffee, sugar, and meat. Goods like gasoline, metal, gas, and rubber were also rationed. Americans, black and white alike, considered these sacrifices worthwhile if they helped even a little in winning the war. Blacks faced discrimination. Unfortunately, despite the great contributions many black citizens made to the war effort, widespread discrimination against them continued. As you have read, the armed forces did not want to accept black volunteers at the beginning of the war. Many civilian organizations felt the same way. African Americans who volunteered to help their country win the war often found their offers of help met with suspicion and distrust. As one journalist later noted, African Americans were fighting Adolf Hitler abroad, even as they were still having to fight Jim Crow at home. During the war, thousands of African Americans left their homes in the South and moved to cities in the North and West in search of better jobs. The black population of many cities skyrocketed. In Los Angeles, for example, the black population more than doubled in a decade, jumping from less than 65,000 in 1940 to more than 170,000 in 1950. City and state leaders worried that racial tension and violence would soon increase because of the rapidly changing demographics. The limited availability of housing and jobs contributed to the mounting racial tension. Unfortunately, in some places, these fears proved correct. During the summer of 1943, for example, major race riots broke out in Harlem, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Beaumont, Texas. Perhaps the bloodiest began in Detroit on June 20, 1943. Several minor conflicts soon escalated into mob violence. Rumors about crimes that blacks and white citizens had committed against each other spread quickly. The fighting intensified, with the riot continuing over the course of 3 days. In total, 25 black residents and 9 white residents were killed. Hundreds more were arrested for looting and other crimes. Finally, the federal government had to intervene to end it. President Roosevelt declared a state of emergency and sent 6,000 troops into Detroit to stop the fighting. Troops occupied Detroit for 6 months. Hoping to prevent a similar situation, some cities made efforts to prevent interracial problems. Although riots did occur around the country in 1943, some cities were able to diffuse tense situations by planning ahead to prevent violent outbursts.